The rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the city streets in a cold, unrelenting deluge. Laura pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame as she stepped off the late bus. Her shift at the diner had ended hours ago, but her manager insisted she stay late to clean up after a spill caused by a rowdy group of late-night customers. Her feet ached, her stomach growled, and the weight of unpaid bills loomed over her like a storm cloud. Money had been tight for years, and with her rent due in 2 days, the pressure felt suffocating. She quickened her pace down the dimly lit street, the flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows. Laura's mind raced with calculations. What groceries could she skip this week? How many more hours she could beg to work? And whether she could delay her utilities payment without losing service. Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the screeching sound of tires sliding on wet pavement. A car swerved violently around the corner, crashing into a lamppost just ahead of her. The impact was brutal. Glass shattered across the asphalt, and the vehicle's front end crumpled like paper. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. As the seconds ticked by, instinct took over. She dropped her umbrella, bolted to the smoking car, and peered through the shattered driver's side window. A man was slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from his temple. "Hey, can you hear me?" "Ah," she shouted, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. Laura's heart pounded as she fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Summoning every ounce of strength, she tugged with desperation until the door groaned open. The acrid smell of burning rubber filled her nose as she unbuckled his seatbelt and dragged his limp, heavy body out of the wreckage. It was only when she pulled him a safe distance away that she noticed the tailored suit, the shining watch on his wrist, and the wallet that had fallen from his pocket, spilling cash and credit cards into a puddle. This man had the kind of wealth she could only dream of. Yet here he was, vulnerable and human, entirely reliant on a stranger like her. As the distant wail of sirens grew louder, Laura knelt beside him, shielding his unconscious form from the rain with her coat. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She stayed there until the paramedics arrived and whisked him away. By the time the scene cleared, she was soaked to the bone, her hands trembling from adrenaline and the biting cold. The next morning, Laura's world seemed to return to its usual monotony. She trudged into the diner, her hair still damp from the rain. But as she wiped down tables, the events of the previous night replayed in her mind. Did the man survive? Did he have a family waiting for him? Was he grateful to be alive? Later that afternoon, she received her answer. A sharply dressed man entered the diner, his presence commanding the room. Laura's manager rushed to greet him, but his gaze settled on her. He approached, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "You're the one who saved Mr. DiLaurentis last night," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "He asked me to thank you." Laura blinked in disbelief. "Mr. DiLaurentis?" "Leonardo DiLaurentis. You might have heard of him." The name rang a faint bell. He was a renowned billionaire, the CEO of some global finance empire. But there was no warmth in the man's voice, no gratitude. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed her a plain white envelope. "This is for your trouble." Inside was a thick stack of bills, more money than Laura had seen in years. For a brief moment, her breath hitched. This could pay her rent, cover her debts, maybe even give her a chance to get ahead. But as she looked at the envelope, and then back at the man's impassive face, a bitter taste filled her mouth. "I didn't do it for the money," she said firmly, pushing the envelope back toward him. The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." Without another word, he turned on his heel and left. As the diner door swung shut behind him, Laura felt an unfamiliar surge of anger. She hadn't expected a parade or a medal, but she also hadn't expected to be dismissed so coldly. It wasn't the money that stung, it was the complete lack of acknowledgement, the assumption that everything in life could be boiled down to finances. That night, as Laura lay awake in her tiny apartment, listening to the hum of the broken radiator, she resolved to put the encounter behind her. People like Leonardo DiLaurentis lived in an entirely different world, one where wealth insulated them from the struggles of ordinary people. But as much as she tried to push the memory aside, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that their paths hadn't crossed by mere chance. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, like the opening chord of a symphony waiting to unfold. If you've ever felt invisible to those in positions of power, leave a comment below. Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable tales that prove life is stranger than fiction. The days that followed were a blur of routine, but the memory of Leonardo DiLaurentis lingered in Laura's mind like a splinter she couldn't dislodge. She resumed her shifts at the diner, each one a monotony of pouring coffee, scrubbing tables, and smiling at customers who barely noticed her. Yet every now and then, the envelope and the man's dismissive attitude would creep back into her thoughts. She couldn't decide if it was the arrogance or the assumption that money could erase humanity that stung more. Laura's focus shifted back to her own struggles. Her rent was overdue, and she was running out of excuses for her landlord. Nights became sleepless as she grappled with the reality of scraping together enough to keep her apartment. The envelope of cash she had refused replayed in her mind, a brief temptation, quickly followed by the bitter aftertaste of what it represented. Across the city, Leonardo DiLaurentis sat in his high-rise office, overlooking the skyline. The accident had left him with a mild concussion and a bruised ego, but his schedule hadn't slowed. The boardroom walls buzzed with tension as executives pitched ideas to salvage his faltering company. Despite his wealth, trouble had been brewing within his empire for months. A string of bad investments, an overly aggressive expansion, and rumors of internal betrayals had chipped away at his control. For a man who thrived on dominance in the world of finance, the cracks in his empire were intolerable. But Leonardo wasn't the kind to reflect on his own shortcomings. Instead, he focused his frustration outward, at his team, his competitors, and anyone who dared to suggest his strategies were flawed. The accident was merely an inconvenience, a distraction from the mounting chaos. Laura's role in saving his life barely registered as more than a footnote in his mind. Gratitude was a foreign concept to a man who believed success came solely from power and money. Meanwhile, Laura's life took a darker turn. Her manager at the diner, who had always been lenient about her late arrivals and occasional mistakes, began to tighten the leash. A younger, more energetic waitress had joined the staff, and Laura sensed her position was being quietly phased out. Each day felt like a slow unraveling, her grasp on stability slipping further away. One evening, as Laura walked home after her shift, she paused at the window of a high-end boutique. The mannequins wore sleek dresses, the kind of outfits that radiated confidence and success. In the reflection of the glass, she saw herself, dressed in a faded uniform, her hair frizzing in the damp night air. A lump formed in her throat as she realized how far removed she was from the life she once dreamed of. Her thoughts drifted back to the night of the accident. She had seen a side of Leonardo DiLaurentis that was raw and unguarded, even if only for a moment. Yet he had chosen to shield himself behind the fortress of wealth the instant he regained his composure. What would it feel like, she wondered, to have the power to brush off problems with a flick of the wrist? To never have to worry about money, rent, or groceries again? The irony wasn't lost on her. Leonardo, with all his wealth, couldn't seem to find stability in his sprawling empire, while she, with nothing but determination and grit, clung to the hope that things might one day change. For both of them, the concept of control was an illusion, albeit wrapped in vastly different packaging. That same night, Leonardo sat alone in his penthouse, the city sprawling below him in a glittering sea of lights. His assistant had left the day's agenda on his desk, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. Instead, his gaze drifted to the framed photo of his father, a man who had built their empire from the ground up. The weight of expectations pressed heavily on his chest. He poured himself a drink and downed it quickly, as though it might drown the nagging doubts that crept into his mind. For the first time in years, Leonardo felt a pang of vulnerability. The accident had shaken him more than he cared to admit. And then there was the woman, the one who had saved him. He couldn't even recall her name, yet her face haunted him in brief flashes. Her defiance, her refusal to take the money, and the quiet strength in her eyes unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. In his world, people were either assets or obstacles. She didn't fit into either category. Across town, Laura lay in her small bed staring at the ceiling. The faint hum of the radiator provided little comfort as she replayed the events of the past week in her mind. A part of her regretted not taking the money. Another part clung fiercely to her pride, refusing to let her worth be measured by a stack of bills. But most of all, she wondered what her life might look like if she ever had the chance to step into Leonardo's world, even for a moment. The city outside remained alive with motion, the lives of millions intertwining in ways both visible and hidden. Laura and Leonardo were separated by wealth, status, and circumstance, but the invisible threads of fate had already begun to weave their stories together in ways neither could foresee. The morning air was crisp, and the city buzzed with its usual chaos as Laura stood in line at a crowded coffee shop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, another reminder of the overdue rent. She ignored it, inhaling the faint aroma of roasted beans as she shuffled forward. Small indulgences like a cup of coffee felt like the only fragments of normalcy she could afford these days. But even those were fleeting, especially with her finances on the brink of collapse. When she finally reached the counter, she caught sight of the pastries on display. They gleamed under the warm light, each one a small, perfect luxury. Her stomach rumbled, but she forced herself to look away. "Just a small black coffee," she murmured, handing over the last crumpled bill in her wallet. As she turned to leave, her shoulder brushed against someone else's. "Excuse me," she said instinctively, barely glancing up. The man she had bumped into was dressed impeccably, his suit tailored to perfection, his leather shoes gleaming. For a split second, she felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't him, but he looked like he belonged in Leonardo's world, a world of opulence where even the smallest details screamed wealth. The memory of Leonardo's cold dismissal resurfaced, and she clenched her jaw, brushing the thought away. She stepped outside, the steaming cup warming her hands against the chill. Despite the heaviness that clung to her, she resolved to push forward. She had to. Across town, Leonardo sat in a conference room, surrounded by his team of executives. The tension was palpable as they reviewed the latest reports. Sales were slipping, and whispers of discontent among investors had begun to surface. His company, once a symbol of dominance in the financial world, was showing cracks that even his sharpest strategies couldn't conceal. Leonardo's gaze drifted to the window where the city stretched endlessly below. He hated these meetings. They were a reminder that even with all his money, control was slipping through his fingers. He tapped his pen against the table, barely listening to the discussion. His mind wandered back to the woman from the accident, Laura. That was her name. He remembered now. For reasons he couldn't articulate, she lingered in his thoughts. Her defiance, her refusal of his offer. It was unsettling. People didn't say no to Leonardo DiLaurentis, yet she had, and she had done so with a quiet dignity that he found both irritating and intriguing. The meeting dragged on, and Leonardo forced himself to refocus. "Cut the non-performing assets," he said sharply, interrupting the financial director mid-sentence. "We need to consolidate our strengths, no more risks." His words were met with murmurs of agreement, but beneath the surface, tension simmered. His leadership was being questioned, and he knew it. In the cutthroat world of finance, loyalty was as fragile as a thread. And lately, it felt as though too many threads were fraying. Back in her small apartment, Laura sat at her makeshift desk, staring at the screen of her aging laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated her face as she typed furiously, searching for job opportunities. She had come across a free course on marketing strategy earlier that day, and it had sparked something in her, a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know much about the field, but she knew one thing: survival demanded adaptability. If she couldn't make it as a waitress, she would find another way. As she scrolled through the course material, a memory from the accident flashed in her mind. The wallet that had fallen from Leonardo's pocket, spilling its contents. Credit cards with limitless potential, cash that could pay her rent 10 times over. A world where money was never a question, only an answer. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. She didn't envy his wealth. What she envied was the freedom it seemed to grant. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was her landlord, his expression a mix of impatience and pity. "Laura," he began, his voice heavy. "I've been patient, but you're 2 months behind. I need the rent by the end of the week, or I'll have no choice but to start the eviction process." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She nodded mutely, promising to come up with the money. But as the door closed, the weight of her reality bore down on her. She was running out of time, and she didn't have a plan. Meanwhile, Leonardo sat alone in his office, the city lights reflecting off the sleek glass walls. His desk was cluttered with reports, each one a grim reminder of the challenges ahead. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie, and allowed his thoughts to drift. He had built his empire with a singular focus: power through financial dominance. Yet, despite all his success, there was an emptiness he couldn't ignore. For years, he had convinced himself that money was the solution to everything. But the woman who had saved his life had shown him otherwise. She had nothing, yet she had acted with a selflessness and strength that he couldn't comprehend. It was a strength he had never found in himself, despite his wealth. The night deepened, and the city hummed with its relentless energy. Laura, huddled in her apartment, began to draft a plan, a blueprint for a new chapter of her life. And Leonardo, sitting high above the world in his penthouse, found himself haunted by a single question: what kind of man had he become? Laura sat at her small, cluttered desk, the faint hum of her laptop filling the silence of her apartment. The light from the screen cast a faint glow on her determined face as she combed through the first module of the marketing course she had signed up for. Words like strategy, branding, and financial planning leaped out at her. They were foreign concepts, yet they carried a strange allure. If she could master these skills, maybe she could finally escape the cycle of survival that had defined her life. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it, too engrossed in the content to move. She scribbled notes in the margins of an old notebook, her handwriting shaky but purposeful. As she worked, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Could she really do this? She had no formal education, no connections, and barely enough money to keep her electricity running. Yet something deep within her refused to let her give up. The fear of failure was outweighed by her desperation to break free from the grip of poverty. Across the city, Leonardo sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, scrolling through his phone. He was en route to a high-stakes meeting with a potential investor, someone who could inject much-needed capital into his struggling company. The tension in his shoulders was palpable, but his expression remained unreadable. Years in the financial world had taught him the art of concealment. Never let them see you sweat, no matter how dire the situation. His phone buzzed with a notification, and he glanced at the screen. It was a news alert about his company's latest quarterly losses. The headline was brutal, questioning his leadership and hinting at an inevitable downfall. He clenched his jaw, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. Despite his vast fortune, control seemed to be slipping further out of his grasp. The meeting, held in an opulent conference room overlooking the city, was tense from the start. The investor, a shrewd woman named Evelyn Carter, dissected his presentation with precision, questioning every projection and assumption. Leonardo, ever the consummate professional, fielded her questions with calculated responses, but he could sense her hesitation. She wasn't just investing in his company, she was scrutinizing him as a leader, a man, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he measured up. Back in her apartment, Laura was experiencing a small victory. She had completed her first module and had even managed to draft a basic marketing plan for a fictional client as part of an assignment. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, a tangible step towards something bigger. The work gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. But reality came crashing back when her phone rang. It was her landlord. "Laura." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Have you managed to pull the rent together? I need to know by tomorrow." Her heart sank. "I'm working on it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After hanging up, she stared at the screen, her reflection faint against the glare. The hope she had felt moments ago was eclipsed by the looming threat of eviction. Her apartment, as small and run-down as it was her sanctuary. Losing it felt unthinkable. Meanwhile, Leonardo left his meeting with Evelyn Carter feeling uncharacteristically uncertain. She hadn't given him a definitive answer, promising to think it over. The words echoed in his mind as he entered his penthouse later that evening. The vast space, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor, felt emptier than usual. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window, staring out at the city below. He thought of his father, a man who had built their empire from scratch, often working late into the night at the family's cramped office. His father's philosophy had been simple: hard work, integrity, and an unwavering belief in people. Leonardo had adopted the first two, but had abandoned the third long ago. Trusting people was a liability in his world, one he couldn't afford, and yet his mind kept drifting back to Laura. Her refusal to take the money he had offered gnawed at him. She had risked her life to save his without expecting anything in return. That kind of selflessness was foreign to him. It made him question everything, his values, his decisions, even his humanity. As the night deepened, Laura sat back down at her desk. Her earlier despair had given way to resolve. She couldn't wait for a miracle. She had to create one herself. She began researching small business grants and freelance opportunities, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Words like growth, budgeting, and financial stability took on new meaning as she realized the power of knowledge in reshaping her life. On the other side of the city, Leonardo opened his laptop and began drafting a plan to counter the bad press surrounding his company. As he worked, he paused, staring at the blank screen. His thoughts strayed to Laura again, and a question surfaced in his mind, unbidden. What if he had gotten it wrong? What if money wasn't the answer to everything? The city outside continued its relentless rhythm, unaware of the quiet transformations taking place within these two lives. Both Laura and Leonardo were grappling with their own battles, unaware of how deeply their paths were about to intertwine once more. The grand ballroom buzzed with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm golden light as a sea of tailored suits and shimmering gowns moved through the space. It was an event Laura could never have imagined herself attending. Yet here she was, standing on the fringes of the crowd, her modest black dress a stark contrast to the opulence around her. The invitation had come unexpectedly. Her mentor from the free marketing course, a sharp and kind woman named Clara, had noticed Laura's potential and taken her under her wing. Clara, a well-connected entrepreneur, believed in opening doors for those willing to put in the effort. When she invited Laura to attend the gala as her guest, Laura hesitated, knowing she didn't belong in such circles. But Clara had insisted, and Laura had reluctantly agreed. She clutched a glass of water, her eyes scanning the room. Conversations floated around her, snippets about investments, luxury vacations, and financial ventures that seemed more like games to these people than the lifelines they represented to her. The weight of her financial struggles felt heavier than ever, but she kept her shoulders square, determined to make the most of the evening. As Laura stood quietly, observing the glittering crowd, a familiar figure caught her eye. Her breath hitched. It was him, Leonardo DiLaurentis. He was laughing with a group of men, his polished demeanor as commanding as ever. The memory of their last encounter surged to the surface, bringing with it a cocktail of emotions, anger, resentment, and an unsettling curiosity. She considered slipping out unnoticed. This wasn't her world, and the last thing she wanted was to cross paths with Leonardo. But as she turned to leave, Clara appeared by her side. "Laura, there you are. I want you to meet someone," she said, taking her arm and leading her toward a group of people before Laura could protest. And just like that, she was standing face to face with him. Leonardo froze, his confident smile faltering for the briefest moment as recognition flickered in his eyes. "Laura," he said, the name escaping his lips almost involuntarily. "Mr. DiLaurentis," she replied, her voice calm but laced with an edge he couldn't miss. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of those nearby. Clara, sensing the awkwardness, quickly filled the silence. "Ah, so you two know each other?" "Small world," she said with a nervous laugh. Leonardo's gaze didn't waver from Laura. "We've met," he said finally, his tone unreadable. Laura met his eyes, refusing to look away. For a moment, the noise of the room faded, leaving only the weight of unspoken words between them. She could see the confusion in his expression, as though he were trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the one he had dismissed so easily months ago. Before the silence could stretch any further, Clara steered the conversation back to safer ground, but Laura barely heard her. Her pulse was pounding, and her mind raced with thoughts of how different she felt now, stronger, more focused, and unwilling to be overshadowed by anyone, even a man as powerful as Leonardo. Leonardo, for his part, was equally unsettled. He had spent months trying to push the memory of her out of his mind, only for her to reappear, this time standing tall in a room filled with the city's elite. She didn't look intimidated or out of place. If anything, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that unnerved him. As the evening progressed, their paths crossed again. This time, it was Leonardo who approached her. "You've changed," he said, his voice low, as though testing the waters. Laura arched an eyebrow. "People tend to, Mr. DiLaurentis." He studied her for a moment, searching for the woman he remembered. But she was gone, replaced by someone who radiated a strength he couldn't ignore. "You look different," he said, his words faltering. "Is that your way of saying I clean up well?" she asked, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. It wasn't like her to be so bold, but there was something liberating about confronting him on equal footing. Leonardo's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "You were impressive then, and you're impressive now," he said quietly. The words felt foreign to him, yet he meant them. Laura didn't respond immediately. She studied him, noting the tension in his jaw and the faint lines of weariness around his eyes. He wasn't as invincible as he appeared. "Why are you here, Mr. DiLaurentis?" Surely you have bigger things to worry about than mingling at galas." His expression darkened slightly. "Even in my world, appearances matter." She tilted her head. Her curiosity piqued. "Your world? And what exactly is that?" His answer was interrupted by someone calling his name. He hesitated, as though he wanted to say more, but ultimately turned and walked away. Laura watched him go, a storm of emotions churning within her. She had come to the gala hoping to make connections, to open doors for her budding career. But instead, she had collided with the past in a way she hadn't anticipated. The encounter had left her with more questions than answers, and a nagging suspicion that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Leonardo, now back among the crowd, found himself glancing in her direction. The woman who had saved his life and walked away without a second thought had reappeared, no longer the vulnerable figure he remembered. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to her in a way that unsettled him deeply. Laura's thoughts lingered on the gala long after the night had ended. Back in her modest apartment, she sat by the window, staring at the city lights, her mind replaying every word, every glance exchanged with Leonardo. She wasn't sure why their brief conversation unsettled her so much. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her, not with the dismissiveness she remembered, but with something else, something closer to curiosity or even respect. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her notebook, where she had scribbled ideas for her growing freelance work. The gala had been a whirlwind, filled with handshakes and polite smiles, but it had also planted seeds of opportunity. Clara's connections had proven invaluable, and Laura had left the event with a handful of potential clients interested in her marketing expertise. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. Yet, despite the positivity, Leonardo's presence at the gala nagged at her. She had spent months trying to forget him, to move past the night she saved his life and the cold, transactional way he had treated her afterward. Seeing him again had reopened old wounds, but it had also revealed something unexpected. He wasn't as unshakable as she had believed. Across the city, Leonardo stood in his office, staring out at the skyline. The glass walls reflected his silhouette, a stark contrast to the vibrant city below. The events of the gala replayed in his mind, particularly his encounter with Laura. She had changed, but it wasn't just her appearance or her confidence. There was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that he couldn't ignore. He turned away from the window, his desk cluttered with reports and documents. The company was still in turmoil, and the investor he had hoped to secure, Evelyn Carter, remained undecided. Her hesitation weighed heavily on him. The board was growing restless, murmurs of dissent growing louder. Despite his wealth and position, the foundation of his empire felt shakier than ever. Leonardo sank into his chair, his thoughts drifting back to Laura. He couldn't explain why she occupied so much of his mind. Perhaps it was guilt, though he rarely allowed himself to dwell on such emotions. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a nagging sense that she represented something he had lost along the way. Laura, meanwhile, was busy. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity as she juggled her diner shifts with her growing freelance work. Her first client, a small boutique owner, had been impressed with her ideas for increasing foot traffic through targeted social media campaigns. The project was simple but satisfying, a tangible sign that she was capable of carving out a new path for herself. But as she built her future, her past began to catch up with her in unexpected ways. One afternoon, as she checked her email, a message caught her attention. It was from Clara, marked urgent. Laura clicked it open, her heart sinking as she read the contents. "Laura, I hate to bring this up, but I heard something troubling today. Apparently, someone has been asking questions about you, your background, your finances, even the work you've been doing recently. I don't want to alarm you, but I thought you should know. Be careful." Laura's hands tightened around her phone. Who would be looking into her life? She hadn't done anything to warrant such scrutiny, at least not recently. But the more she thought about it, the more uneasy she felt. The timing was too coincidental. Her mind raced back to Leonardo, to the way he had looked at her at the gala, and a chill ran down her spine. Could he be behind this? That night, she lay awake, staring at the cracks in her ceiling. The idea of Leonardo prying into her life filled her with equal parts anger and anxiety. She wanted nothing to do with him, yet their paths seemed destined to cross again and again. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a game, one she didn't understand but had no choice but to participate in. Meanwhile, Leonardo sat in his penthouse, the city stretching out before him in a sea of lights. He had received his own unsettling news earlier that day, a report from his legal team about a potential lawsuit brewing against his company. It wasn't unexpected. The cracks in his empire had been growing for months. But what bothered him most was the source of the lawsuit, an anonymous whistleblower claiming internal corruption. The accusation was vague, but it hit too close to home. For years, he had turned a blind eye to the darker corners of his business dealings, trusting his team to handle the details while he focused on the big picture. Now, that trust seemed misplaced. As he sifted through the documents, his thoughts kept circling back to Laura. There was something about her that he couldn't let go of, a connection he couldn't sever. And in the quiet of his penthouse, a troubling realization began to take shape. She might be the only person who could help him make sense of the mess his life had become. But how could he approach her after everything that had happened? Would she even listen? For the first time in years, Leonardo found himself at a loss, uncertain of his next move in a game where the stakes had never felt higher. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Laura paced her small apartment, the email from Clara replaying in her mind. Someone was digging into her life, and she couldn't shake the suspicion that Leonardo was involved. The thought infuriated her. He had already dismissed her once. What more could he possibly want? Her grip tightened on her phone as she considered calling Clara to demand more details, but she stopped herself. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't solve anything. Instead, she threw herself into her work. Her latest client, a local bakery, had asked her to design a digital campaign to boost their online presence. It was challenging, but Laura found solace in the distraction. The work was methodical, creative, and rewarding. A far cry from the chaos her life had been before she discovered this path. Yet even as she focused on her projects, a faint sense of unease lingered in the background, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Leonardo stood at the center of his sprawling office, surrounded by his senior team. The atmosphere was charged with tension as they reviewed the latest developments in the looming lawsuit. His legal team had been working tirelessly to uncover the identity of the whistleblower, but the trail was murky. Whoever it was, they were careful, leaving only fragments of evidence that hinted at internal corruption. Leonardo's patience was wearing thin. "Find them," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "I don't care what it takes. We're not losing this battle." As the meeting adjourned, Leonardo lingered in the room, his thoughts drifting. He had built his empire on ambition and strategy, but now it felt like the foundation was crumbling beneath him. The betrayal, whoever it was, gnawed at him, not just because of the threat it posed, but because it confirmed something he had been avoiding for years. The rot in his empire wasn't just external, it was internal, born from the very culture he had fostered. In the days that followed, Laura noticed strange occurrences that deepened her unease. Her phone buzzed with unknown calls that hung up as soon as she answered. An email inquiry for a potential freelance project turned out to be a dead end, with no sender information to trace. And then there were the subtle, almost imperceptible signs that she was being followed. Shadows lingering too long at street corners, the same car parked near her apartment more often than seemed coincidental. One evening, as she walked home from a meeting with a client, her unease boiled over. She stopped abruptly, turning to face the empty street behind her. "Whoever you are!" she called out, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "Stop hiding! I know you're there!" Silence. Laura stood frozen for a moment before turning and continuing on her way. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. By the time she reached her apartment, she was trembling, her resolve cracking under the weight of fear. Across town, Leonardo was experiencing his own unraveling. His team had managed to trace the whistleblower to a former employee, someone he had once trusted implicitly. The revelation left him reeling. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid burning his throat as he stared at the city lights from his penthouse. The betrayal stung more than he cared to admit, but it also forced him to confront a harsh truth. His empire was crumbling not because of external forces, but because of his own blind spots. And then there was Laura. Her face lingered in his mind, unbidden. She represented something he couldn't quite define, a reminder of the humanity he had buried beneath layers of ambition and wealth. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow connected to everything unraveling in his life, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The next day, Laura's growing unease took an unexpected turn. She was meeting Clara for coffee when a man approached their table. He was impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. "Miss Laura?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Laura stiffened. "Who's asking?" The man reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. The name on it sent a chill down her spine. Leonardo DiLaurentis. "He would like to meet with you," the man said simply. Laura's instinct was to refuse, to tell the man to deliver a message that she had no interest in anything Leonardo wanted. But something stopped her. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe it was the lingering sense that their paths hadn't crossed again by coincidence. "When?" she asked, her voice steady. The man smiled faintly. "Tomorrow, noon, his office." As the man left, Clara leaned in, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What's that about?" Laura shook her head, her mind racing. "I have no idea." The next morning, as Laura rode the elevator up to Leonardo's office, her nerves buzzed with a mix of anticipation and dread. She had no idea what to expect, but she was determined not to let him intimidate her. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into the sprawling office, her heels clicking against the polished floors. Leonardo was waiting for her, standing by the window with his back to the door. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice quieter than she remembered. Laura crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I didn't come for pleasantries. What do you want?" Leonardo hesitated, an uncharacteristic flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "I need your help," he said at last. The words hung in the air, unexpected and unsettling. Laura's mind raced, the implications of his request sinking in. Whatever he wanted, it was bigger than either of them. And for reasons she couldn't yet understand, she had the sinking feeling that saying no wasn't an option. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside the towering glass walls. Leonardo's words lingered in the air, his request striking Laura like a wave crashing against the shore. She searched his face for answers, but all she found was the same unshakable determination she remembered from their previous encounters. Yet there was something new, a vulnerability buried beneath his carefully constructed facade. "You need my help?" Laura's voice carried equal parts disbelief and suspicion. That's rich coming from you. Leonardo sighed, his shoulders stiffening. I'm aware of how it sounds, but this isn't about pride or arrogance. This is about survival. Your survival, Laura shot back, her tone sharp. I thought people like you didn't need anyone else. Leonardo didn't flinch. If anything, her words seemed to strike a nerve. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sit. Let me explain. Against her better judgment, Laura complied, lowering herself into the plush leather chair. Her arms crossed tightly, a barrier against the unease creeping through her. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she knew better than to trust someone like him. Leonardo leaned against his desk, his posture deceptively relaxed. There's a storm brewing, he began, his voice measured. My company is facing a lawsuit. A whistleblower claims there's corruption within my organization. If they succeed, everything I've built will collapse. Laura tilted her head, her skepticism evident. And where do I fit into all of this? I don't know anything about your world. That's exactly why I need you, Leonardo said, his eyes locking onto hers. You're an outsider. You're not tangled in the politics, the games, or the lies that plague my industry. I need someone who can see things clearly, without bias. Laura blinked, momentarily stunned by his candor. You expect me to just dive into your mess because you think I have some magical perspective. It's not just perspective, Leonardo said, his voice softening. It's integrity. You risked your life to save a stranger without expecting anything in return. That kind of person is rare, and I can't afford to trust anyone else. The room fell silent again as Laura absorbed his words. Part of her wanted to laugh, to throw his request back in his face. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to challenges, couldn't ignore the gravity of what he was asking. Helping him would mean stepping into a world she had always resented, a world defined by wealth and power. Yet, there was something about his plea that felt genuine. What exactly are you asking me to do? She asked cautiously. Leonardo straightened, relief flashing briefly in his eyes. I need someone to review the evidence, to piece together the puzzle. My legal team is too close to it. They're missing something, and I need a fresh perspective. Laura shook her head, overwhelmed by the weight of his request. I'm not a detective. I'm not even sure where to start. You're resourceful, Leonardo said simply. I've seen that firsthand. And you won't be alone. I'll give you access to whatever you need. The words hung between them, the enormity of the situation sinking in. Laura knew this wasn't just about Leonardo's company. It was about her stepping into a world she had always avoided, a world that had dismissed her as insignificant. If she accepted, it would mean confronting her own fears and insecurities. What's in it for me? She asked finally, her voice steady. Leonardo hesitated, as though the question had caught him off guard. A chance to prove that people like you and me aren't as different as you think. The answer wasn't what she expected, and it left her more intrigued than she cared to admit. She studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. Fine, I'll help. But don't expect me to pull punches. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Leonardo's mouth. I wouldn't expect anything less. The next few days were a whirlwind. Leonardo provided Laura with access to a trove of documents, financial records, internal memos, and legal filings. At first, the sheer volume of information was overwhelming, but Laura's natural curiosity and determination kicked in. She pored over the details, her sharp mind picking up patterns and inconsistencies that the legal team had overlooked. As she worked, she began to see cracks in the narrative Leonardo had presented. The whistleblower wasn't just an angry ex-employee. They were someone with a personal vendetta, someone with a connection to Leonardo that went deeper than business. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the truth wasn't as simple as Leonardo had made it seem. Meanwhile, Leonardo observed Laura's progress from a distance. He couldn't deny his growing admiration for her. She was relentless, tackling the task with a focus and integrity that reminded him of the person he had once aspired to be. Yet her presence also unsettled him. She was a mirror, reflecting back the flaws he had spent years trying to ignore. Late one evening, as Laura sifted through another stack of documents, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. A series of payments, carefully hidden among routine transactions, pointed to a bribe, a substantial one. The recipient's name was encrypted, but the timing and context were damning. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. This wasn't just a case of corporate corruption. This was personal, and it was bigger than she had anticipated. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they painted was far more dangerous than she had imagined. And for the first time, Laura wondered if she had made a mistake stepping into Leonardo's world. The glow of Laura's laptop screen cast long shadows across her cramped apartment as she leaned forward, her heart pounding. The numbers and encrypted names on the document blurred together, but the implications were clear. These payments weren't just a fluke. They were a calculated effort to hide something massive, something deeply entangled in Leonardo's company. She reached for her notebook, flipping through pages of scattered notes. Her fingers trembled as she cross-referenced dates and figures, piecing together the puzzle. Every thread she followed seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. Someone inside Leonardo's empire had orchestrated a network of bribes to silence dissent and maintain control. But the scope of the corruption wasn't what shocked her most. It was the name buried in the metadata, barely concealed by layers of encryption. The person behind the payments wasn't just an employee. They were someone close to Leonardo, someone who had been working against him for years. Laura sat back in her chair, her chest tightening as she considered the implications. The betrayal wasn't just corporate, it was personal. Her phone buzzed, startling her. The caller ID flashed a name she wasn't expecting, Leonardo. For a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to answer. But curiosity and a nagging sense of responsibility got the better of her. "Laura," his voice came through the line, low and tense. "Did you find something?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, but it's complicated." There was a pause, and she could hear the faint sound of city traffic in the background. "I'm coming over. We need to talk." Before she could protest, the line went dead. Laura stared at her phone, a mixture of frustration and unease swirling within her. She wasn't sure how much she could trust Leonardo, but the gravity of what she had uncovered made it clear that she couldn't handle this alone. Less than an hour later, Leonardo arrived at her apartment. He looked different in this setting, out of place among the peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture. His tailored suit and polished demeanor were stark contrasts to the worn-down edges of Laura's life. Yet there was something in his eyes, tiredness perhaps, or a flicker of vulnerability, that made him seem almost human. Laura gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, his posture stiff. "What did you find?" he asked, his tone clipped. She slid her laptop across the table, the incriminating document open on the screen. This, payments disguised as routine transactions. Bribes, I'm guessing, to keep certain people quiet. Leonardo's jaw tightened as he scanned the data. His expression was unreadable, but the way his hands clenched at his sides betrayed his tension. "Who's behind it?" Laura hesitated, knowing the name she was about to say would change everything. "It's someone close to you, someone you trust." She reached over and highlighted a section of the document, revealing the decrypted metadata she had uncovered. The name stared back at them both, stark and undeniable. "Marco," Leonardo whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. Marco was more than just an executive. He was Leonardo's right-hand man, a figure who had been with the company since its inception. The betrayal hit like a thunderclap, the weight of it written plainly on Leonardo's face. "I trusted him," he said, more to himself than to Laura. "He's been with me since the beginning. He was supposed to protect this company, not destroy it." Laura watched him carefully, her own emotions a tangled web of sympathy and skepticism. "It's not just about the company," she said softly. "This is personal for him. These payments aren't random. Marco's been positioning himself to take control from within." Leonardo's gaze snapped to hers, the fire in his eyes unmistakable. "He thinks he can take everything from me?" "Not thinks," Laura corrected. "He's already started." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the enormity of the situation settling over them. For Laura, this was a glimpse into a world she had never wanted to be part of. A world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was inevitable. For Leonardo, it was a reckoning, a confrontation with the consequences of years spent prioritizing power over people. "What do we do now?" Laura asked finally, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her mind. Leonardo straightened, his resolve hardening. "We fight back." The next few days were a blur of activity. Laura and Leonardo worked side by side, combing through every piece of evidence they could find. It was an uneasy partnership, Laura's pragmatic approach clashing with Leonardo's relentless determination, but their shared goal kept them focused. Every discovery brought them closer to the truth, and every truth revealed the depths of Marco's betrayal. But the closer they got, the more dangerous the game became. Laura noticed strange cars lingering near her apartment, the same unsettling calls with no voice on the other end. She didn't tell Leonardo at first, not wanting to seem paranoid, but the fear gnawed at her. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let them expose the truth without a fight. Leonardo, too, began to feel the pressure. The walls of his empire were closing in, and the people he once trusted were now potential enemies. Yet amidst the chaos, he found himself relying on Laura in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her perspective, her tenacity, and even her ability to challenge him when no one else dared. It was all unexpected, but it kept him grounded. One evening, as they pored over documents in Leonardo's office, Laura leaned back in her chair, exhaustion etched on her face. "Why do you care so much?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Leonardo looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because this isn't just about the company, it's about who I am, and I don't like the person I've become." The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Laura didn't respond, but something in her softened. For the first time, she saw the man behind the empire. Not the billionaire, not the arrogant CEO, but someone who had lost his way and was trying to find it again. As the night deepened, the pieces of the puzzle finally began to fall into place. But the picture they revealed was more dangerous than either of them had anticipated, and the storm that was coming threatened to destroy them both. The city was cloaked in darkness, its lights glittering like distant stars against the cold glass of Leonardo's penthouse windows. Laura stood by the desk, staring down at the final document they had uncovered. Her heart raced, a mix of triumph and fear coursing through her veins. This was it, the proof they needed to expose Marco's betrayal and the web of corruption he had woven within Leonardo's empire. "It's all here," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "These payments, the falsified reports, the shell companies, it's enough to bring him down." Leonardo, seated across from her, nodded slowly. His expression was unreadable, a mask of composure hiding the turmoil within. For all his wealth and power, the battle they were about to fight felt different, personal, vulnerable. "We'll have to move fast," he said, his tone decisive. Marco won't go down quietly. He'll try to bury this before it sees the light of day. Laura met his gaze, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. And if he comes after you? Leonardo's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. He already has. The room fell into a tense silence, the enormity of their plan settling over them. They had compiled a meticulous dossier of evidence, one that could destroy Marco's career and restore some semblance of integrity to Leonardo's company. But releasing it would come with risks, legal battles, public scrutiny, and the very real possibility that Marco wouldn't go down without a fight. "You're sure about this?" Laura asked, her voice softer now. "There's no turning back." Leonardo rose from his chair, his presence commanding as he crossed the room to stand beside her. "I've spent my life building an empire I thought I could control," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But control means nothing without accountability. It's time to set things right." Laura nodded, a quiet determination settling in her chest. Together they finalized their plan, sending the evidence to trusted allies within the media and legal circles. It was a calculated risk, one that relied on exposing the truth before Marco could retaliate. The next 24 hours would determine everything. As dawn broke, the first ripple of their actions became evident. News outlets began reporting on the corruption scandal, their headlines bold and unforgiving. "Whistleblower unmasks dark secrets of DiLaurentis empire," one read, while another declared, "Power struggle within DiLaurentis Corp exposed." The story spread like wildfire, the weight of the evidence too damning to ignore. Back in her apartment, Laura watched the coverage with a mix of relief and apprehension. She had spent the night on edge, her phone buzzing with calls and messages from reporters seeking statements. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange sense of closure. For the first time, she felt like she had made a difference, stepping out of the shadows of survival and into a place of purpose. Leonardo, too, faced the fallout with a newfound clarity. As the scandal unfolded, he held an emergency board meeting, addressing his team with a candor they had never seen before. "This company was built on ambition, but we lost sight of what matters," he said, his voice steady. "That changes now." Marco, blindsided by the revelations, made one last desperate attempt to shift the narrative. He called for Leonardo's resignation, accusing him of orchestrating the scandal to cover his own failures. But the evidence was irrefutable, and Marco's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of his lies. By the end of the day, Marco was removed from his position, escorted out of the building as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. For Leonardo, it was a bittersweet victory. He had reclaimed his company, but the cost had been steep. A reminder of the fragile line between power and vulnerability. As the dust settled, Laura found herself back at the diner where it all began. She sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her life was still far from perfect, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward on her own terms. The sound of the bell above the door caught her attention, and she looked up to see Leonardo entering the diner. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, his suit replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. He spotted her and approached, his expression softer than usual. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the seat across from her. Laura shrugged, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Suit yourself." He sat down, his gaze meeting hers. "Thank you," he said after a moment, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." She tilted her head, studying him. "You needed someone to tell you the truth, even when it hurt. That's what happens when you stop surrounding yourself with people who only tell you what you want to hear." Leonardo chuckled, a genuine sound that surprised even him. "I guess I needed a reminder of what integrity looks like." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the hum of the diner filling the space between them. Finally, Leonardo reached into his pocket and pulled out a check, sliding it across the table to her. "What's this?" Laura asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your share of the settlement," he said simply. "You earned it." Laura glanced at the amount and felt her breath catch. It was more money than she had ever seen, enough to change her life. But as she looked at Leonardo, she realized it wasn't the check that mattered. It was the journey, the choices, the sacrifices, and the lessons they had both learned along the way. She slid the check back toward him. "Keep it. I don't need your money." Leonardo stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Why?" Laura's smile was faint but resolute. "Because I finally figured out what I'm worth, and it's not measured in dollars." As she rose to leave, she paused, glancing back at him. "Take care of your company, Leonardo, and maybe this time take care of yourself too." He watched her go, a sense of quiet respect settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt lighter, as though the weight he had carried for so long had finally begun to lift. And as Laura stepped out into the bustling city, her head held high, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she controlled her destiny. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your favorite moments, or even your own story of resilience. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales of human strength, vulnerability, and the extraordinary power of connection.